Welcome, everyone, to the Shakespeare Association of America's YouTube channel, where today we'll be in conversation with the winner of the 2024 SAA First Book Prize, Professor Noémie Ndiaye. My name is Carla Mazzio. I teach at the University of California, Riverside, and I had the great honor of serving as the chair of the First Book Prize Selection Committee for this past year. So I just want to say the prize was inaugurated in 2023 in honor of Jerome Singerman, pioneering publisher in early modern studies, and I think really importantly, a serious supporter of early career scholars in the field. So the prize seeks to recognize genuinely outstanding books with a significant Shakespeare component, published as the first book-length monograph by current members of the association. In order for SAA members to begin to get a sense of the prize-winning books and their authors, we are hosting a series of relatively short, relatively informal conversations with the authors. I'm honored to be hosting one of those conversations, again with this year's winner, Noémie Ndiaye, for Scripts of Blackness, Early Modern Performance Culture in the Making of Race, published with University of Pennsylvania Press in late 2022. So let me first ventriloquize the committee, because we all had a little hand in co-writing this very short blurb at the end of our deliberations of upward of 24 submissions for the prize this year. This groundbreaking book on performances of race in 16th and 17th century England, France, and Spain expands theoretical paradigms, comparative and transnational approaches, and archival resources available for the study of Shakespeare, early modern dramatic and cultural history, and pre-modern critical race studies. The book maps out three distinct modes of representing African diasporic people in performance, involving acoustics and kinetics, as well as visuality, prompting a fundamental reconsideration of theater in the history of race. Noémie is currently Associate Professor of English Literature at the University of Chicago. With a coterminous appointment in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, she is published quite broadly in Shakespeare Quarterly, Renaissance Quarterly, Renaissance Drama, Early Theater, ELR, Literature Compass, and elsewhere. She's also the co-editor with Liam Markey of Seeing Race Before Race, Visual Culture in the Racial Matrix in the Pre-Modern World, ACMRS Press, which is brilliantly available in open access as of 2023, and also awarded a prize, this time by the American Association, the Association of American Publishers. Noémie is currently at work on a second book monograph, tentatively entitled The Whiteness Between Us, Early Modern Playbooks of Racial Triangulation, exploring the interpolation of various communities of color in the Black-White binary in early modern drama and beyond. A second project that seems to have some seeds in this first book that hopefully by the end of today we can talk a little bit about. So first of all, thank you so much, Noémie, for being here. Welcome. Hi. Thank you for writing the book.
Well, thank you for, serving as chair of this committee, and thank you for reading the book, appreciating it, and hosting this conversation today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's my honor, really. And really, it's a generous book. It's a generative book. It's a page turner. And I think that it offers so much because it works across three languages, three national literatures and traditions, across different modalities of performance. And what I also love is that it really introduces the reader to really the last decade, as well as the earlier years of criticism and pre-modern critical race studies in traditions of England, France, and Spain, even as you set yourself apart. So it's a very, very useful book, an archivally deeply rich book and methodologically rich book. But before we get into the specifics, maybe we can just start with, I'd love to hear you talk about what you see as the major contribution, the major claim of this book. how you might see it as an intervention in Shakespeare studies. And then we can sort of pick up from there. So the larger claims and for this audience, how you might see it as an intervention in Shakespeare studies.
Sure, thank you. So I would say that the project of the book starts with the realization that a major epistemological change happened in early modernity in relation to Blackness. Blackness, it's been studied by PCRS scholars working on the Middle Ages. So Blackness was already an object of interest and study prior to early modernity. But what happens in early modernity is that it becomes conceived of not just as any form of difference, but as a form of racial difference, meaning a form of difference that is meant to organize power relations, to organize and justify the distribution of resources, rights, and privileges across the board in early modern Europe. So this happens, of course, because of the political, colonial, economic developments of early modernity and the imperatives that they generate. But the question I was trying to answer in the book was, okay, and how did this change? Well, how was it integrated, right? How did it come to permeate modes of thinking? How did the ordinary European person, European X, how did they start thinking about Blackness in this new mode? And the short answer was, well, it happened thanks to or due to the mass media of the time. Theater, more generally, performance culture, because I'm not looking only at commercial theater, I'm looking at court culture, but I'm also looking at what happens during block parties, what is happening around the street, what is happening on plantations, what is happening on slave ships. So performance culture more generally. And the answer is that performance culture actually generated new modes of thinking about Blackness. And to locate those new modes, I'm looking at one specific interface, which is the interface between techniques of racial impersonation, embodied techniques of racial impersonation. As you said, I'm looking at the visual, so the cosmetic Blackness. I'm listening for the acoustics of racial impersonation. What does it mean to speak Black? And I'm looking at kinetics. What does it mean to move Black or dance Black? So that's one side of the interface. And the other side is those scripts, which is the term I use to refer to metaphors, to metaphorical strains that you can find and track and study, open up in dramatic text, doing some old school literary analysis and close reading. But those metaphorical strains were actually generated and supported by the techniques of embodiment. So I'm looking at what happens when those metaphors are encountered by spectators in the moment of live embodiment in the playhouse. And some of those scripts won't surprise the reader. The script of the demonizing script, what I call the diabolical hermeneutics of blackface, for instance. Readers of English drama are familiar with that. What might surprise them would be to find out that in Spain, where this specific script developed very early, it also disappeared very early and was replaced by another dominant script, which I call the script of commodification. And really here is the question is, what does it mean for spectators to encounter Black characters personated as Black on stage through metaphors that depict them as commodities? It can be foodstuff, right? Chocolate, for instance, or it can be metaphors that have to do with the world of learning. The character of Juan Latino is compared to an ink pot. What does that mean? What does that do to him? Or it can be luxury goods like jet, ebony, amber, if you're talking about mixed race characters. So that's just to give an example of what I mean by scripts of Blackness. And really the argument is that at the end of the day, it is the recursive and expensive use of those metaphors encountered in the moment of live performance that permeated European minds and created new ways of thinking about the real life Black people who either did live in Europe already or would ultimately come to live in Europe. So that's, that was the project and that's the main claim. But in terms of, your question was about intervention in Shakespeare studies, what is new, what is different. the transnational and comparative dimension of the project, I think, is, the main contribution to the field. And I'm championing it, not because I like writing very long books, but because the development of what I call the racial matrix and racial formations in early modern Europe was a transnational project, was an intercolonial project that relied on circulation, conversations and modes of distinction between colonial powers, right? So to understand what happened in England, I'm arguing that we need to look at what was happening in the Hispanic world, and we need to look at what was happening in the Francophone world. Mind you, I'm just dealing with those three countries. I do think that what's happening in Portugal was crucial. I think there's a ton of work to be done on Dutch archives, Italian archives, of course. This is just the beginning of a larger project that can only be carried by a whole community of scholars. I cannot do it all on my own. I'm not interested in doing it on my own. But so yes, the comparative and the transnational is one big contribution, and the other main contribution I see in this project is this focus on the performative, right? On performance, because there's plenty of gorgeous PCRS. When I say PCRS, I mean pre-modern critical race studies. There's a lot of gorgeous PCRS scholarship that has focused on race and early modern English drama. But my focus is really by focusing on this interface between the techniques of performance and dramatic poetry. We become able to see new modes of racialization that had not been excavated before. And here I'm thinking really about the acoustic mode of racialization, what I call black speak and dance. I think the reason why those have not been seen before might be that they are perhaps more discrete in the English archives than in the Spanish archive, for instance. So this is an instance where the two contributions are actually locked in together, right? The comparative mode just enables you to see more things in each of the archives.
Thank you. That's fantastic. Could you follow up a little bit on your sense of periodization and sort of field, which is another area, because it seems to me that in returning to the English archive, you ended up moving a bit later and kind of reinvigorating various aspects of restoration drama and various techniques. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that as well, your sense of how the book opens up fields temporally as well as spatially and linguistically.
That's a great question. I would say that when you work comparatively, because the timelines of early modernity are different in each nation, you will end up with an unorthodox chronology to start with. I think, as far as English studies are concerned, I'm not the only PCRS scholar to move from Shakespeare all the way to restoration drama. Some scholars like Urvashi Chakravorty, for instance, are interested in thinking about late humanism up to Milton, right? So this chronological arc that jumps over the interregnum is not unique to me. But I do have to start earlier, to start in the 1530s, because in Spain and in Iberian drama, this is when representations of Blackness start taking flight. And in the new project I'm working on at the moment, I go all the way up to 1715, encroaching upon 18th century terrain, because this is, the death of Louis XIV is really the moment that marks the end of early modernity. And this is the moment when it becomes legal also for enslavers to bring their enslaved people to the metropole. So, dealing with this comparative framework forces you to be creative when it comes to chronology. I would say that I love restoration drama. It is not receiving as much love as it should. And it hasn't always been the case, right? If you look at the early work of Ayanna Thompson's first book was all about restoration drama. It's a fabulous book. The work of Joyce Green MacDonald, right? There is a tradition in PSRS of looking at restoration drama. I think that tradition might have subsided in recent years. And I'm just trying to revitalize the earlier energies in that sense.
That's fantastic. Yeah, Joyce, yeah, fantastic of putting that in context with earlier work, and also the necessity of thinking creatively, because you are organizing the book not chronologically, but conceptually. And I wonder, for those who haven't read the book, if you could talk a little bit about your methodology. It's very creative. It's very careful in its iteration of key terms, its mode of representing translation on the page, its use of commonplaces, so instead of blackface, for example, it's black up. Instead of habla de negros, it's black speak. And from the level of those scripts and your terminology, you're very, very attentive to scripts at the level of methodology. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit both about the overarching methodology of chapter organization, and then get a little bit micro, and unfold for us a little bit about some of the necessarily creative work that you do, both with renaming terms and also with neologizing. So, for example, I love your use, instead of, reparative work or paranoid, you have a wonderful, playful, but also very productive idea of reparanoid, the reparanoid work of this book. And also this wonderful also notion of recording, and coming out of work in Black studies, but also extending it. So if you could talk about the organization and also some of the methodological work that organization enables, and that'd be great.
Okay, thank you. That is a beautiful, complex question with a lot of moving parts. But as to the first half of the question, the general organization of the book, I think really that the decision to organize the book based on techniques of performance comes from my own original training as a professional actor. I went to acting school in France for 4 years, and I was doing that while completing my bachelor and my master's in English studies, focusing on drama. So I think that this comes, this all comes from the fact that for me, this was an embodied experience to start with, and the question of how race is created on stage, and how racial notions come to inform what we think this or that actor can do, should do, is meant to do, and is meant to, and how they're meant to be on stage. That comes from my own personal experience, right? So it was an embodied thing to start with. And I think that that dimension is what ultimately determined the structure of the book. But I have to say that this came, in installments. If you compare the book to the dissertation, for instance, in the dissertation, I already had a separate chapter on Black speak, acoustic Blackness, and a separate chapter on Black dance. But I had 3 chapters on cosmetic Blackness that were organized by national tradition, right? And part of the whole reworking of the manuscript that happened when I was turning the dissertation into a book consisted in being more adventurous and bolder about embracing embodiment as the organizing principle for the whole thing, and making sure that in each chapter I would bring together the 3 national traditions I was working with. So I think it was always meant to be, but it came gradually. As to the second half of your question, so you mentioned reparanoia. Reparanoia, bringing together the paranoid and the reparative modes of reading, as we all know them, was my way of trying to articulate my own critical affect and how I was moving through this project emotionally, effectively. And of course, this conditioned a number of subsequent methodological decisions, such as the ones you mentioned: how to translate or not translate certain terms, how to name or not, how to name certain people, when, and under which set of circumstances and conditions. But reparanoia is really me trying to disclose, to be transparent about the fact that I have a wide range of effective responses to the material that I'm studying. And I share the inclination that many PCRS scholars have of trying to give an account of Black life in early modernity that is not just the tale of horror and oppression that we all already know. You know, we don't need to relive that. And when I say we, I'm thinking about PCRS scholars of color in particular. We don't, you know, if the goal is not to re-traumatize us, right? So trying to do something that exceeds the trauma, exceeds that heinous account, and while keeping in mind at the same time that the profundity of racial violence in early modernity is still very much unacknowledged in many quarters of early modern studies across the board, not just English. And the reparative drive can often lead us to elide some of the darker aspects of the archive. So how to fully account for that violence, tell the truth about it, because that story still needs to be told, and do something else at the same time and move beyond it at the same time. That's what the reparanoid critical affect is trying to code. I don't know that I managed to, you know, live by its promise, but that's what I was going for.
Yeah, and it seems to unfold, thank you, beautifully over the course of the book. There seems to be a trajectory moving toward a sense of resistant possibility, not an outright embrace of it through the analysis of the technology of dance. On the way there, I did want to ask you, and this is in response to something you just said, which is, you know, the violence of the archive, finding more and more and more of it in there. And when you think about yourself on stage, in academia, and as a teacher trying to give more attention to Renaissance and particularly Restoration dramas, what do you think about the idea of putting them into performance, given what you disclose so powerfully about the violence within those texts? And how would you counteract some of the modes of toxic racial impersonation that you see happening there?
I think it's a great question. It's not a question that can be answered in the absolute. It really, you know, it's a job. It requires a particular training to be able to do that work. And I don't think that our conditioning as scholars of early modern English literature or just early modern literature necessarily prepares us for that. I think it's the work of dramaturg. And I started serving as a dramaturg like 2 weeks ago on one project, and just the work of having those intense conversations with the director and working with the idiosyncrasies of both thinkers in addition to the idiosyncratic features of the early modern text. It's just, I'm not being very articulate right now, but what I'm trying to convey is that if there is a way of moving around the toxicity or moving through it, which would be my personal inclination, it is going to emerge organically from a collaborative process between the artists and us. I do think that we should be part of the conversation, you know, that on big productions that hire a professional dramaturg who's not necessarily versed in PCRS, a PCRS scholar should be at the table talking to the dramaturg and the director. I also think that those conversations can be complicated. In my experience, I'm thinking about what happened a few years ago, being in conversation with a wonderful director who was doing Pericles at the moment when I was thinking about, apologies about that. I was thinking about whiteness, dynamics of white world making in Pericles and all the racial violence that unfolds, and sharing those thoughts with the director. I could see that it didn't quite lend, or it didn't work for him. It didn't do for him what he needed in order to be able to turn this into a cultural product that makes sense and does some healing today. So, short answer, those conversations are complicated. It's going to be production based every time, but I am eager to be part of more and more such conversations.
What was your favorite part of the book to work on? And that is my way of asking you to go into one perhaps chapter and give us a sense of the texture for you of both pleasure in discovery, in research, in thinking that worked with a working through of the violence of the materials you were encountering. But so in other words, what chapter sort of gave you the most pleasure to write and why?
I think it's the last chapter, the chapter on dance. And based on what I hear, it's also the one that gives readers most pleasure. So, so it's the reward for making it to the end of this really, really chunky volume. But it is the chapter on dance because we're getting back to a question you asked earlier, actually. But it is the chapter on dance because that's the one where dynamics of power were most ambivalent, right? What I'm arguing and showing in that chapter is that dance was a very fertile terrain for power play, power negotiations, as in it was a medium which in live performance supported all sorts of animalizing, sexualizing, infantilizing scripts that would racialize Black people. But it's also the medium for which the archives actually show us Black people responding, Black people remobilizing the techniques of Black dance, as in dances that were not necessarily Black in origin, but were perceived as Black and as expressing Black identity, right? You see in Spain, for instance, a lot of Black Iberians reclaiming them, using them professionally to make a living. We have the example, for instance, of this late 17th century dancer, Black dancer from Madrid called Francisco Meneses, who actually danced so well and so much that he made enough money to buy his own freedom, right? To get his own free papers. His story does not end well, but this is an interesting moment, I think, in terms of showing the ambivalent power play that dance enabled. And then in the rest of the chapter, I'm tracking that ambivalence in the French and especially the English archives in a play like Massinger's The Bondman, for instance. So, without giving too many details, I would say that that chapter is the one that I had most pleasure writing, precisely because it is a moment where in my reparanoid critical affect, the reparative could come through a little bit.
Beautiful, thank you. So, writing a book.
Yes. How do we do
it? Bringing it to completion. I didn't mention at the outset that you were also the recipient of the Leeds Barrel Prize for the SAA for the best dissertation, I think in 2019.
Yeah, yeah. 2018, I believe.
Thank you, 2018. So there are various stages for everybody involved in coming to an argument and writing up and finishing the dissertation and then moving to the book. And I wonder if you could talk about that. What was most supportive, most helpful for you, both first in writing the dissertation, right? For folks in grad school now seeking out structures of support, institutional structures, individuals, but then also really shifting from dissertation to book and making that leap. So often the pressure is get it out, get it out, get it out. And you did get it out, but there seems from your earlier comments to have been a period of let me reflect, let me reorganize. And if you could talk a little about both of those stages, what really helped you the most?
Yes, the period of reflection, reorganizing, redoing things differently. It very specific to that time period, but I had just moved to my current institution, University of Chicago, and I was very fortunate to have a course release, and we're on the quarter system, so I had a course release for winter and spring 2020, which, if you remember, was an interesting time period. It coincided with the beginning of pandemic, right? So it was a moment of isolation for all of us in a sense. It was also a moment when I found myself with a lot of free time on my hands because of that course release. And here I want to say that first, it was a productive time for me only for two reasons. A, I had completed all my archival work prior to that moment, so I was not stranded like so many scholars who needed archives in that moment. Second, I didn't have children yet. So I could actually use that time, unlike so many of our colleagues, parent colleagues. So just placing those disclaimers. With those disclaimers in place, this was an extremely productive time that was really conducive to stepping back and, taking account of what I had done, what needed to be done, and what I wanted to do differently. I have to say also, by temperament, writing has always been my happy place, and the moment of writing coincides with the moment of thinking for me, which is not the case for everybody. So I've never had trouble moving forward or completing projects, and I count myself very, very lucky on that front. But something that has always helped me going was having writing buddies. That was the case in grad school. Erica Richardson, Rosa Schneider, and Tarini Mukherjee. If you hear me, thank you. But once pandemic started, because we were so isolated, I actually realized that it was a good moment to resume that practice. So I had writing buddies with whom I would meet on Zoom. And this is the equivalent of accountability groups. So many of us have accountability groups, except it was with close friends for me. And I have maintained that practice. Actually, an hour after this conversation, I have a meeting with my writing buddy for the new project. So I do highly encourage graduate students or early career researchers to make writing the social activity. And to do it not just with other people who need to complete their project, but to do it with people you care about, people you like, have fun with, and with whom you can exchange ideas. So that has been incredibly helpful. Is there something else I wanted to share on that topic? Yes, maybe one last thought on this topic. And this is advice that I give to the graduate students I work with now as faculty. It's to really break down the process of writing, whether it's a paper or a book, break it down into the different phases, the brainstorming phase, the reading phase, the outlining phase, the write it out phase, the editing phase, the clean your footnotes phase, do your break it down into a clear number of phases, because each phase can bring its own pleasures. So break it down and then go moving through each phase, find out where the pleasure is. The reading phase for me, it's a moment of, oh my God, this stuff exists. I had no idea. No one ever told me. Just your horizon is expanding exponentially. That is an incredible source of pleasure. The outlining phase. Okay, I have an argument. I think I have something to say. And I love structure, as you might have noticed from the book, to get it and say, okay, I see how to structure maybe my thought, and let's see how it goes. And then the writing out phase, woo, I wrote 5 pages today. I'm feeling good. Let's go get a margarita with my friends. When the moment comes to clean the footnotes, do the bibliography, I do it in music. It is extremely, pay attention to your pleasure as you move through this process, and structure it so that there is a room for pleasure in each phase.
Fabulous. Thank you. I suppose as a way to kind of move us toward a close, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, I tend to ask questions in 2 parts, but the first would be the present and future of your own work. And if you'd like to link it back to a moment in the book that inspired your thinking about this, I'm thinking of a few, but I would love to hear that. And the second part is, future, what you see as present, imminent, exciting future directions for Shakespeare studies, particularly pre-modern critical race studies.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so the book project I'm working on right now, that you kindly mentioned earlier, The Whiteness Between Us, it is about moments of triangulation, of racial triangulation. Moments when I see characters of color who are not Black, and that can be Muslim characters, Jewish characters, Indigenous people of the Americas, Romani people, folks from various parts of Asia. I see those characters being interpolated into a black and white racial binary, and that happens through their insertion into pre-existing dramaturgies of Blackness. So, Scripts of Blackness kind of did the work of laying out what the dramaturgies of Blackness were. And what I'm realizing is that those dramaturgies of Blackness did more work than just racialize Blackness, because they were so effective as racializing tools to start with. They developed this kind of magnetism. They developed new functionalities that really allowed white supremacy to position or reposition, right? In the case of Jewish or Muslim characters, for instance, reposition them within the racial matrix in order to bring into being a global and domestic architecture of power relations that they could only dream of at the time, but that they aspired to. Right. So this mobilization of dramaturgies of Blackness became a way of dreaming into being the project of whiteness, if you will. So I'm going in the direction of early modern critical whiteness studies, and I'm not the only one. I'm following Urvashi Chakravorty. I'm following Miles Greer, of course, the incredible volume by Arthur Little, the work of David Sterling Brown. Over the last 3 years, we've seen the field moving in the direction of studying whiteness, which I find very exciting. And I think this is actually a good connection to the second half of your question. What do I see as exciting future directions for the field? I do think it's great that PCRS is going in that direction, because in a sense, it's a way of moving beyond isolating paradigms, right? Because whiteness is ultimately the root cause and the end product of early modern racial formations, right? So studying it directly is a way of eschewing all those class is more important than race. But what is race? Is race only Blackness? What about the whataboutism? Just moving beyond all those questions to look at the real problem, right? So I find that very exciting. But I would say one thing I would like to see, and it's something I'm trying to champion in my new project, is a transnational and comparative way of doing critical whiteness studies. In a sense, I would be very sad. I would find it to be a missed opportunity if this new exciting critical development for pre-modern critical race studies nested within Shakespeare studies repeated the previous mistakes of the field, or, mistake might not be the right word here, but repeated the limitations of previous stages in the field, if that makes sense. And I want to say, as you very well know, Renaissance studies and early modern studies generally have historically been very open to comparative and transnational approaches. Shakespeare studies, not so much, for obvious reasons, right? And because Shakespeare studies was the field that enabled the development, that was most welcoming to the development of pre-modern critical race studies, we have somehow worked within those limitations. I think what I'm championing really is a realignment of PCRS with more general, maybe older the dynamics of comparative and transnational thinking within early modern studies. So let's keep doing the awesome work of developing critical whiteness studies, and let's do it in exciting, comparative, and transnational ways.
What a beautiful way to end, and what a call for the present and future of PCRS and early modern studies. What a beautiful, beautiful book. I encourage everybody not to, to go out and get that book right away, get it for your libraries. Think about it, teach, talk about it in groups. It is doing a tremendous amount of work and opening up a lot of these questions about triangulation, critical whiteness, and precisely the intersectionality that is much more visible, and the coalition building, I would think, under regimes of whiteness. So thank you so much. Have a fabulous and pleasurable afternoon. And thank you for meeting, for your time, and for your book, Noémie.
Thank you so much, Carla.
Okay.